but welcome to Measurable Energy webinar. I am joined by Richard Hipkiss, who's a director at Elemental, board member of the Mobile and Portable Buildings Association. Welcome, Richard. Thanks very much for giving up some of your time.
Thank you, Dave. Good to be online.
So what we are going to talk about today is busting this myth. So we're focusing very much on temporary buildings, on construction site accommodation particularly, and we are going to be talking about this hypothesis. So investing in energy efficiency for temporary buildings is a waste of time, and of course a waste of money is implied in here too. So the housekeeping is, if you have any questions, please submit them in the comments below this stream, and it will be recorded and we will share to you afterwards, and it will be available after we complete the webinar. We've got about half an hour, so we will try to finish by past. We are cognizant of diaries, so people with an 11:30 will have about 20-minute discussion, and we'll have time for taking those questions at the end as well, and we'll still try and finish in around about half an hour. So with that in mind, a little bit of background on Measurable Energy for those who don't know us, and some may know us from the world outside of temporary buildings. So the technology and the business was created to find and eliminate plug power wastage, and in temporary buildings around about 95% of the power is coming through things plugged into appliances, plugged in to sockets and wired into fuse spurs. Those kinds of appliances could be things like water heaters, panel heaters, coffee machines, TVs, monitors, you name it. Most of the power in temporary buildings is in that plug power mode. And of course, lighting is one of the areas of things that is not plugged in. Those will tend to be on different circuits. So what Measurable Energy, the technology does is basically eliminate the plug power that is being consumed when nobody's using those appliances. So typically about half of that plug power is wasted, and that's because things are being left on when they're not being used. So water heaters are keeping water hot overnight and all weekend. It could be space heaters are heating rooms when the windows are open and it's not needed. Coffee machines keeping water hot. TVs on standby in meeting rooms that are not being used, and all of that adds up. From our data, we see about half of it is wasted. So the technology finds that and eliminates that automatically. So that's the little bit of background about Measurable Energy. And what we're talking about today is temporary accommodation, temporary buildings, mostly in construction sites. And so here is a construction site, and typically what we see in these types of projects is that we have a number of buildings, and some of them, like this one, is a nice big one. Some of them have hundreds or even thousands of people working on site in temporary buildings, and the buildings are catering for a number of different activities. They will have offices and meeting rooms. They also have, of course, changing rooms and loos and drying room facilities. They'll also have welfare, canteens. They'll have training centres, and some of them are, as I said, are incredibly large. And what we are addressing in all of these different types of buildings is, as I've mentioned before, the kind of appliances that we are looking at is heating and cooling for water and space. We've got lighting systems which are addressable outside of Measurable Energy, but also office equipment, kitchen appliances, all of those things which we are currently deploying into temporary buildings on construction sites. So that's kind of the background. This is our sort of playground, if you like. And we're going to talk a little bit more now about the kinds of energy that's used and some of the challenges that are happening in construction sites. And I'm going to hand over, Richard, to you to explain a little bit more in detail about what's going on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. Well, first off, I have to apologise. Fully immersed within the topic of conversation, I am on a construction site. So if you do hear any banging or drilling, that is just because I'm where we're talking about. So Elemental, we work with clients across temporary and permanent buildings, providing monitoring solutions at all levels. So really focused on the electrical distribution, what you see here on this image, the multiple kind of levels of energy use on the site. And really where are sites monitoring and why? Well, what we find is that monitoring is generally selected based upon one of three reasons. It's either to control cost, to reduce carbon, or for a compliance reason. Now, a bit more on that compliance reason a little bit later on, but if I kind of go down the diagram there, starting at the top, a prosumer installation is much more common these days. That's where there's multiple points of supply. So on my little diagram there, I'm trying to show that you've got a generator, typically diesel powered electricity output, and you've got solar. We see wind less often, and then you've obviously got connections directly to the grid. Now we're seeing more and more monitoring at those levels, but for the purpose, most likely it's to either monitor generator use or so that a site can publish how much solar generation that it's actually creating on the site. However, mostly what we see is kind of like the red dot on the second level, where most sites we work with are still only monitoring that point of supply, which is great for kind of going into your overall carbon footprint. It's great to get an overall understanding of cost of the site as a whole, but it doesn't really do a lot more. It doesn't really help with any cost or carbon reduction. So it's really at the next level down where monitoring each cabin or each module slice and significant loads is much more useful for cost allocation, and also to kind of demonstrate areas where a lot of energy is being used. So for example, we're now seeing in Part S of the building regulations that for every 10 parking spaces, whether it's a temporary or a permanent building, you've got to be providing EV charging. So that can be a large load, hence it's typically monitored. But even at this level, you don't really see any focus on energy reduction or carbon impact. So that's where monitoring at a device level is essential for energy and carbon reduction. And of course, to better manage costs or allocate it to the different users of the site. It's quite often you can have multiple subcontractors in different areas where there's only one bill for energy. So given that temporary accommodation is typically a mix of very few fixed appliances, but quite an extensive plug load, that's where working with measurable energy has been quite key. And as a partner of measurable energy at Elemental, we think it's important to consider all the individual levels of monitoring. And if we could just go on to the next slide, please, Dave. If we focus on carbon reductions for a moment, so at Elemental, we've been working with customers for the last 20 years on energy reductions, and carbon reduction has slowly crept us on us. And the net zero commitment appears here to stay. It's written into UK regulation at a high level at government. The aim is to meet net zero by 2050. Now, what we've seen across the all levels of industry, from industry associations or influential bodies, is the guidance around carbon reduction and implementing net zero plans. Now, what's important for this is that, an example is the Construction Leadership Council has emphasised the need for the alignment of construction site activities with net zero goals. So it's not just about the operational energy, it's also about the embedded energy or the embodied carbon that's within the construction phase of a project. So this means for all organizations across the supply chain, focusing on their carbon footprints is important to manage their own scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. But it's also remembering that somebody's scope 1, scope 2 is their supplier's scope 3 and continuing up the chain. So used at a site level, it's important to consider how that they can make an impact. And if we move to the next slide, Dave, what we've got there is an example of what I would consider quite an innovator in the field. I've been working with the Wernick Group as Elemental for the last 8 years now. It's been a journey of innovation, developing their carbon reduction plan, their carbon management plan, setting targets to net zero that are measurable, auditable, and as we've said there in the slide, validated. I think it's very important that transparency and accuracy has come through. Now, one of the reasons that Wernick, I see quite an innovator there is, with the measurable energy intelligent sockets, they've not only been working to reduce their own scope 2 emissions with a fantastic case study at their head office down in Wickford, but they've also been working to install them within their temporary cabins, which impacts their scope 3 and the occupier scope 2. And I think you've got some figures on that, Dave, haven't you?
I do, and let me just go to the next slide. Yeah, and so we've got some numbers here, which of course we'll share around. This is available. This is public data available for anybody. With some Wernick figures on the left, this is across. These are example projects, and these are typical examples that we see. So across temporary accommodation in construction sites, and we've included one of Wernick's peers as well, Premier Modular, another provider of cabins. And so the project that you see on the left-hand side, so nearly 50% energy reduction. As I mentioned earlier, half of plug power is typically wasted, and these numbers really kind of align with that. 45% CO2 emissions, again reflecting mostly the timing when things are being switched off. In that particular case, six months payback. We often see less than a year for payback. That can be accelerated, and the example on the right hand side with one of Wernick's and Premier Modular's customers with Kia, with this particular location, the payback was even quicker, and that payback can be accelerated if, of course, the site's using diesel or HVO and the cost of electricity is so much higher. But even with a grid connection, we're seeing in-year payback for the solution on accommodation. I will move on to the next slide, Richard, unless you have any other points to make on those numbers.
I mean, I think just to reflect on the numbers a little bit there, I mean, they're large percentage, and I think in even it shows that within a temporary building installation where there may only be site accommodation required for 12 months, it shows that it's actually worth considering the results, let alone where there's a project that's on site for 4, 5, 7, 8 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And even short ones are paying back. Short hires are still paying back. And of course, the savings are to some degree to do with how much things can be switched off and when the team aren't there on site. But we've seen significant savings even with 24/7 sites. So that can be managed, and we've got some good results that show, yeah, it doesn't need to be a 5-day-a-week operation to make these kinds of savings. We can still make great savings even if it is a 7-day-a-week site, so or even a 24/7 site. So that's yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. I think, Dave, it's also to recognise that you know, once the installation has been made, it becomes part of the hirer's asset. You know, so those sockets, those fuse spurs, they still stay there. So whilst it might be a decision for the first customer of use of the modular building or the temporary building, it rolls into the next user of that cabin. So the savings have already been realised.
Absolutely, and that's recycling the technology into further hires. It can come back on the off-hire process, go back out again to a different site, and you're right, the investment in the hardware has been made. It's then an even better business case, going forward from there. So the longer the term, the better.
Absolutely.
100%. So we're just coming up on 20 past 11, and really what we wanted to highlight here on this short webinar is that, as you've seen from the example projects that we've just shown, that energy efficiency savings are achievable even on incredibly short hires for temporary buildings. As Richard explained earlier, that scope 2 reduction, which of course then goes into scope 3 up and down the supply chain, is massively important to the construction industry, is now baked into legislation and compliance. And to Richard's point earlier, and perhaps you could just summarize really the importance of appliance level control, Richard. You mentioned that often there's some monitoring at an incomer level, perhaps a meter, but increasingly we're seeing the need to be able to control, to be able to measure, but particularly to control appliance level information is absolutely critical in the pursuit of those energy savings.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so those are the takeaways. If you want to find out more, Richard, perhaps you could just briefly explain a little bit about the surveys that Elemental does and how they work.
So this was very much if there's if you're still uncertain, if you still maybe the figures are too good to believe, we can audit sites. Every site is slightly different. So you can uncover opportunities. There is such a thing as temporary monitoring as well as temporary buildings. So you can monitor various different loads for a set period of time. The longer that site is going to be active with buildings there, it's worthwhile engaging an expert for interpretation and possible intervention. So whether that's energy allocation, energy reduction, or to feed into your carbon management plan, it all translates into the same savings. Yeah, thank you, Dave.
Fantastic. And lastly, from the measurable energy side, if you go to our website, measurable.energy, you will also find an energy savings calculator. You can, so the data that we collect from all of the appliances, thousands, tens of thousands of appliances that are plugged in. So we've got lots of very good data that's fed directly into our calculator. So you can plug in your own numbers at that calculator. You can see what energy reduction is possible, put in the cost of the power, and it will also even generate a return on investment figure for you as well, including the hardware and the services as well. So that's a good tool to have a play around with. And that was our last message on the deck. And then we'll just go over to some questions which can be put into the comments, as I said earlier. So we've got a few minutes, so we'll take any questions from those comments. We've got a couple which I can start with, which are already here. The first one, Richard, I think alludes to something you were talking about earlier on carbon reduction. So first question is, I've worked on plenty of temporary sites, and I get that plug load can add up, but compared to things like embodied carbon, so if you think about the concrete that's being poured and the metal and everything in the building that's being built, so compared to embodied carbon, savings seem pretty small. Is it really worth the effort focusing on plug power when obviously the bigger carbon issues lie somewhere else?
I think that's a really good question, and I get asked quite a lot. And I mean, I think it's important to realise that the journey to net zero, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So 2050, whilst it may seem close, is quite far away. So manufacturers are being pressured to reduce the embodied carbon in the actual products. So take steel, for example, probably represents the majority of carbon within any modular building at the moment. And the operational carbon, as it stands today, the operational energy impact to that may be relatively small, but it'll become larger over time. And it's also important to consider that there's between 250 and 500,000 modular buildings out there in the field somewhere. So I once read a book, and it was called Small Changes times Multiple equals Big Impact. So it's important to see it from that point of view.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. And I think that actually goes quite neatly into another question here. And you mentioned legislation and standards going forward. So second question is a quick one on the bigger picture. If Nigel Farage ends up calling the shots on UK energy and climate policy, heaven forbid, do solutions like this have a place, or do we risk this kind of innovation getting sidelined? Good question there.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to look at that, really. I mean, the first one could be, it depends if any large energy company sponsors Farage to actually be their spokesperson, then he might change his mind. But perhaps more importantly, it's important to note that the legislation and regulation that we've got today is written into text, and it doesn't get changed overnight. Any changes that need to be made by any government have to go through a political process, and typically can take years, not months. So nothing's going to change immediately. Plus, outside of government bodies, climate change has been proven as a science. It is a global initiative. And whilst there might be other voices out there that are equally as dissident on climate change and carbon reductions as Mr. Farage, there are a larger number of supporters for it. So I think it's safe to say that it's not going to go anywhere soon.
Yeah, I think so. I completely agree, and I would add to that, though, that and one of the sort of philosophies that we have at Measurable Energy is that carbon reduction shouldn't cost, and so and one of our mantras of our CEO is that the lowest carbon kilowatt hour is the one that you don't use, and so if you're looking at paybacks of in-year payback in those business cases, then why wouldn't you? It takes me back to, it shows how old I am. So my school days, when we had those little yellow stickers above the light saying switch it off, we knew that was all about saving energy, nothing to do in those days to do with carbon reduction. And so it was just good practice. So if we can save energy, save some money, if the business case just makes sense, then across all of those modular buildings, those site accommodation cabins, of course, why wouldn't we do that? It all adds up, and you can put money back in your pocket.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note there, that forget carbon for a moment. Even if we just consider the cost of energy, I'm sure there are potentially people on the call that have worked on Hinkley Point or the extension to Sellafield. So the investment in plants like Hinkley Point and Sellafield don't come cheap. Who ultimately is going to pay for them? We are, through our energy bill. So whilst energy costs may have stabilized at the moment, within the next 5 to 10 years, they're only going to go in one direction. Now, that may be a direct kilowatt hour charge, or it may be linked to pass-through charges. So we see other elements of our bill getting higher, but ultimately they will be linked to use. So it's so important to consider the kilowatt hour above anything else. Reduce the kilowatt hour, you reduce the cost, and you reduce the carbon. Easy.
Brilliant, and what a great summary to end on. I see there, and we don't have any other questions right now. So if you do have questions after watching, please comment, and we'll respond afterwards. But for now, Richard, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thanks for your time. You've been incredibly generous, and we will leave it there. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you
Thanks,
soon
everybody.
for another webinar. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.